Hey everybody, welcome back to the Least Cities podcast. My name is Janai Jackson, and today I want to talk about something that I've been thinking through quite a bit lately as I've been working my way through Paul's letters in chronological order. Which, by the way, if you've never done that before, then I want to highly recommend that you go and do so. I mean, it's been helpful for me, and I can't recommend that enough. In fact, right now, I'm still in 2 Corinthians with my wife, but as I was wrapping up my study in chapter 7, and I really don't know why I did this, but I decided to take a little sneak peek into Romans, as that would be the next letter in this chronological order. And honestly, Romans is just one of those letters for me. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? Have y'all came in contact with just one of those letters? You see, Romans is that letter for me. It's easily one of my favorites. It's dense, it's robust, and Paul is doing a lot of heavy lifting all in one place, and I absolutely love it. But more specifically, I found myself lingering in Romans chapter 1, especially in verses 18 to 32 of Paul's letter. And as I was just reading and reflecting on that passage, something clicked for me. Not because the text was new to me by any means. I mean, I've read the text a million times before, but it was something clicked because of a conversation that I've been hearing more and more in atheistic and agnostic circles. You see, there's this category that's been popularized as of late, at least in online discussions, called the non-resistant non-believer. Have you probably heard of that before? I don't know how popular it's exactly been, but I remember hearing it for the first time when Alex O'Connor, introduced this. Now, whether or not the term originates from him is really not the point that I'm making. Rather, the point is that I remember how that idea really caught my attention. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with what that term means, the basic idea behind it goes something like this. A non-resistant non-believer isn't ignoring evidence for God. They aren't suppressing truth, and they aren't trying to live as though God doesn't exist. Rather, they simply haven't been convinced, right, by the different arguments, by the evidence that Christians pose for the existence of God, right? The arguments for God to them feel ad hoc. They feel unpersuasive. Now, to be clear, my goal in this video is not to mock that claim or even scoff at it. In fact, when I first heard that claim, I actually thought it was a very strong objection by the atheists or the agnostics, because it's very difficult, as many of you already well know, to argue against someone's lived experience. And so when someone tells you that this is genuinely how I see the world, Janai, or this is genuinely what I think, or this is genuinely what I feel, I feel like it would be very inappropriate and even a bit intellectually dishonest to just wave that away as if none of that actually matters. See, personally, I don't think that's the best posture to take in response to those issues or to even those comments. However, I also think it would be equally, if not even more inappropriate, to simply ignore what Paul says in Romans chapter 1, especially as a Christian. Because as I was reading that chapter, it seems pretty clear to me that Paul is saying that humanity does in fact know God, at least in some sense. And so if that's true, then that immediately raises a problem for this idea of a non-resistant non-believer. Because if Paul is right, then the issue isn't merely a lack of persuasion or some type of missing data. It seems to me something far deeper than that. And so what do we do with this tension? And more pointedly, does Romans chapter 1 actually portray atheists or agnostics as liars? You see, I want to explore that question in this video because that's often a claim that gets thrown around in these types of conversations. And so if that is what Paul is saying, then we need to understand how to articulate it better and more carefully as Christians, as I feel like most of us or a lot of us are just being kind of reckless with some of the language and rhetoric that's been going around here. And conversely, if that's not what he's saying, then we need to be just as careful not to put words into Paul's mouth. All right, so with all that being said, let's start walking through this question together. And actually, before we even get into the weeds of this conversation, I think it's best that we take a quick pause for a moment and address a really common caricature that I unfortunately see a lot of Christians fall into when it comes to addressing this moment in their apologetics. And that's just this tendency to just walk up to an atheist or to say to an atheist some way or somehow in the conversation that they are liars. You see, not only do I think that that's rhetorically unhelpful, but I also think it's just theologically sloppy. Because you see, what often ends up happening in those types of situations is that Romans chapter 1 gets weaponized in a very, very shallow way. And so instead of helping us understand what Paul is actually saying, it just shuts down the conversation altogether. And so if our goal here is to get at the truth of what Paul is teaching us, then I think we need to move past that approach. All right. And so for the sake of this video, let's just move past that. Now, I'm not going to read this entire passage in full, in its entirety, but I will have the relevant portion up on the screen, specifically verses chapter 18 to 22, as I think that's really the crux of the issue that we need to key in on here. You see, as we're looking at that passage, I think that the key to understanding Paul's argument, as I was kind of reflecting on it whenever I was meditating on it and just thinking about what Paul is getting at, I think the key to understanding Paul is going to come down to one single word in verse 18. And that word, my friends, is suppress. You see, believe it or not, that word is doing a tremendous amount of work for us. And so if we miss what Paul means by it, then we're going to misunderstand pretty much everything that follows. Because, and I can't describe to you the moment that I came to this realization as I was reflecting on it. Suppression assumes possession. You see, you cannot suppress what you do not already have. Isn't that fantastic? And so right from the start, Paul is not describing people who are merely ignorant or people who lack data or people who just haven't been exposed to enough revelation. Rather, he's describing people who are actively restraining, actively repressing, and actively holding down the truth about God. And that's important because that means this idea of suppression is absolutely foundational to the entire argument that Paul is laying out for us. And so if we get that wrong, then I think we're going to get Romans chapter 1 wrong. Now, I know many of you, probably sense that this immediately raises another question, doesn't it? Right? Because if Paul assumes that humanity possesses knowledge of God, then what kind of knowledge is he talking about? I think that's a perfectly normal and natural question that usually comes up after you would make that point. At least that's what I was kind of going through in my mind, right? What is the nature of this knowledge that Paul says every human being has? And I think that's a good question. And it's definitely something that we need to, drill down a bit more on. You see, as we pay close attention to the text, I think Paul is assuming a few things here, and I wrote down 4 specific things that I want to list, and hopefully I'll have it up on the screen. You see, first, he is assuming that the knowledge of God that humanity has is real, right? It's authentic, right? This isn't some type of illusion or fiction. This knowledge of God is as real as it gets. But, and this is the second thing, and this is very important, he also assumes that this knowledge is not necessarily articulated. In other words, humanity doesn't neatly comprehend this knowledge or is able to systematize it right off the bat, right? Clearly, that's not the case. Otherwise, we would already have done it by now, right? It's something we sense more than it's something that we can fully explain. And if I was to put it in more plainly. Now, third, he assumes that this knowledge is not philosophical. Right? Paul does not present it as something that human beings arrive at through abstract reasoning or through some type of careful argumentation. In fact, as we'll see later, Paul explicitly rules that out. And finally, to the fourth and final thing that I wrote down, Paul assumes that this knowledge is not systematic. Now, what I mean by that is that it's not a fully formed theological framework that everybody's working out of. It's not a creed. It's not a doctrinal sheet. It's not a worked out worldview that we are all operating off out of. Again, it's more of a sense, right? It's an innate awareness of God. And so taken together, what Paul is describing is a kind of pre-theoretical knowledge, right? This is not Now, to be clear, this is not a conclusion that people reason their way into. Rather, it's an awareness that people reason themselves away from. And that distinction matters. In other words, God created human beings as God-aware beings. And that awareness is not an add-on, but rather it's part of what it actually means to be human in the first place. To be human means to be God-aware. Now, I want to be very clear for here because I understand whenever I say that, some people are immediately going to hear what I'm not saying. You see, I am not saying that everyone has the same level of clarity about God. And I'm not saying that everyone has the same vocabulary. We clearly all do not articulate the same theistic being. And I'm not saying that everyone has the same theological understanding either. And I'm definitely not saying that everyone can sit down and explain the doctrine of God in any meaningful way. Again, just right off the bat. Rather, what I am saying is that every human being has just enough knowledge to be held accountable for suppressing it. That, my friends, is what I am saying. And I think that's what Paul is saying too. And interestingly enough, even atheists have noticed something like this, especially when I started to do a little bit of digging on this. For example, Pascal Boyer, who is himself an atheist, famously argues in his book, Religion Explained, that human beings are, as he puts it, inescapably religious. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that Pascal Boyer is necessarily arguing the same thing that Paul is arguing. I don't think he is. Rather, what I am saying is that in his book, Pascal Boyer explains this phenomenon in evolutionary terms. And so I want to be clear in what I am saying that Pascal Boyer is doing, because I definitely don't want to put words in his mouth, and I definitely don't want to overstate my case. But what I do want to point out is the overlap. Because what Boyer explains by way of evolutionary processes, Scripture explains through creation. You see, even from a completely different starting point, Boyer still recognizes that there is something there. It's the point that I'm getting at. There is something universal. There's something persistent. There's something deeply embedded inside of human nature itself. And so while we may not arrive at the same conclusions, atheists and theists, we're clearly looking at that same reality. And Paul, in Romans chapter 1, is giving us the theological explanation for it. And so with that framework in place, I want to address another very common misunderstanding about Romans chapter 1. One that I see quite often, even among well-meaning Christians, and it's this idea that Paul is given the teleological argument and the moral argument for the existence of God as the basis for humanity's belief in God. As if the way in which we come to that belief in God is by way of human reasoning. And I want to say this very clearly for the record, that is not what Paul is doing here. In Romans chapter 1, Paul is not arguing that natural theology somehow generates knowledge of God. Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page, when people talk about natural theology, for those who don't know what that term means, what they usually mean is reasoning about God from nature, from the created order, or using our minds or intellect to arrive at a knowledge of God, right? Things like design and purpose and morality and order and so on and so forth. I mean, the list can go on and on. And so I want to let everybody know that Paul absolutely includes creation in his argument, but the key here is how he's using it. You see, Paul is not saying that creation is the source of our knowledge about God. Rather, he's saying that creation confirms and impresses and it renders unmistakable what is already known about God right from the outset. That is what he's doing. In other words, creation and conscience function like amplifiers, right? They don't introduce God to us for the first time. Rather, they intensify and expose a knowledge about God that was already there, right? Nature doesn't bring God onto the scene. It removes any excuse for denying him, right? And that distinction is very crucial for us to understand. And I think this is actually just a good place to define natural theology just a little bit more carefully, because I understand natural theology is something that's very often misunderstood, not just by atheists, but also by a lot of Christians in our own right? Natural theology, my friends, does not create truth. It does not replace revelation. Rather, it clarifies and sharpens what has already been made evident to us. And so once you understand it that way, something interesting starts to happen, because now you start to notice that the sheer abundance of arguments for God's existence actually points to the obviousness of God's reality, not its obscurity. Right, the fact that we can articulate multiple lines of argumentation, right, from the teleological argument, the moral argument, the cosmological argument, and then so on and so forth, all of that suggests that this reality is pressing in on us from all sides of this conversation. And so with that being said, let's look more closely to the teleological argument that Paul leans into here, because he actually does present that in Romans chapter 1. Now, for those who don't know, the teleological argument for the existence of God is essentially the idea that because there is something rather than nothing, and because that something displays remarkable order and purpose and design, it points to not merely to an impersonal cause, but to a personal and intentional creator. In other words, when we see design, we instinctively know and can reasonably and rationally conclude that it implies a designer. Now, I know this is where atheists often push back and say that appealing to God is ad hoc here, right? It's an unnecessary explanation, and that we need to somehow empirically demonstrate that God really is the one behind all of this. But this is where I think William Paley's famous watch analogy is just very helpful here. You see, in his book, Natural Theology, Paley asks us to imagine walking alongside a beach and just coming across a watch that's lying in the sand. Now, when you pick up that watch, it would be foolish to try to use that watch as an empirical tool to tell you everything you need to know about its creator. Right? We know that's kind of absurd, right? The watch isn't going to tell you what the watchmaker looks like, or how tall he is, or what he eats for breakfast. Rather, what it does tell you is something else that's very important, right? It's going to tell you that the watchmaker was intentional, that the watchmaker was intelligent, that the watchmaker was purposeful. That is the things that it will tell you. And so, to put it more simply, Paley's watch analogy shows us how the complexity and specificity of the design reveal real attributes about the designer, even though the designer himself is not contained within the object. That's what it's kind of getting at. And so if that's true of a watch, then how much more true is it of the world, right? Especially when we're talking about a finite creation, pointing toward an infinite and eternal God. You see, at that point, it becomes absolutely absurd to demand that a finite effect must somehow contain or fully disclose its infinite cause. That's simply not how causality works. And you know, this actually reminds me of an interesting exchange between Richard Dawkins and John Lennox. You see, in their debate on the existence of God, John Lennox presses Richard Dawkins on the question why there is something rather than nothing. And Dawkins essentially responded to Lennox's question by saying, well, we just don't know yet. But hold up, Lennox, given enough time, science will catch up and eventually give us that explanation. Now, if you're paying really close attention, you can immediately see the problem with that response. My friends, that is not an argument for God. All that is just a postponement of an explanation, right? It's deferring the question indefinitely rather than trying to answer it. And I think it's at that point where Paul's logic comes into full view here, because what is that if not suppression, right? Suppression, my friends, doesn't always deny truth outright, right? This is what we have to see and realize and kind of nuance a little bit. Suppression sometimes simply defers the quest for truth just endlessly. And so we can actually see the exact same pattern show up whenever Paul moves to the moral argument for the existence of God. And again, for those who don't know what that argument is, that argument is basically the idea that without God, there is no objective morality, right? If there are moral laws, then by definition, there must be a moral lawgiver. Otherwise, what we call morality just collapses into personal preference or social consistency. I think we all kind of instinctively know this. We grasp this. Although, again, this is where that suppression comes in, right? And we can see this whenever we ask the simple question, why is it wrong to murder? You see, many atheists will try to answer that question by appealing to something like, human flourishing, for an example. And on the surface, I can totally understand how that can sound really, really compelling to a lot of people who are just getting into these conversations for the first time. But if you press just a little bit further, I think at that point, the problem will become very obvious to you, because that answer assumes that human flourishing in and of itself is good, which itself is a moral claim. And so at that point, we have to ask ourselves another question. Why does human flourishing even matter? Is it really good? And more importantly, what if someone doesn't care about it? Are they wrong? And if so, why? You see, unless you arrive an objective moral lawgiver, that line of questioning never actually ends. Rather, it just becomes circular and it dissolves into a type of relativism. And that's because moral claims assume value. And value assumes grounding. And so without that grounding, without anything objective anchoring that claim, you're then left endlessly searching for something to ground or anchor your values in. And so what this shows us is that even here, we can see that living morally while denying moral grounding is yet another form of suppression that we see. And so now that we have the proper understanding of what Paul is actually teaching us in Romans chapter 1, I think we're finally in a good position to answer the central question on the table, which is this. Does Romans chapter 1 call atheists and agnostics liars? Now, I know this is the point where some of my Christian brothers and sisters may feel that impulse rising up in them to say, yes, of course it does, Janai. Haven't you just showed us that, right? They're clearly all liars. But this is exactly where I think we need to slow down the most and just apply some nuance and actually use the framework that we've been building this entire video. Because suppression is not the same thing as lying, even though the two are closely related and at times are basically adjacent to each other, right? In other words, they run alongside one another, but they are not identical with each other. Suppression is something that happens inwardly. It is moral in nature, right? That's why Paul tells us that the truth is suppressed in unrighteousness in verse 18. In other words, what he's telling us is that something is happening at the level of desire, at the level of love and moral orientation. That's what he's getting at. Lying, on the other hand, is the outward expression of that inward reality. And that distinction absolutely matters. And as Christians, we should want to make sure that we make that distinction in our apologetics, because that tells us that lying is not the starting point, it's the outcome, right? That is why Jesus says in Mark chapter 7 that it's not what goes into a person that defiles them, but what comes out of them, right? What Jesus is showing us here is that things like slander, things like false witness or deceit, they're not just random actions. They are expressions, right? They reveal what's already present in the heart, right? The outward act exposes the inward condition. And so in the same way, lying is not the root issue here. Suppression is. And so to help us understand why people suppress the truth in the first place, we really need to bring in what Jesus says in John chapter 3, because I think that this is just super highlighting whenever you see that. You see, in that passage, Jesus tells us that the light has come into the world, but people did not come to the light because they loved the darkness. Now, I just need you to key in on that word there, loved, because that's extremely crucial, because it tells us that this issue is not a lack of light. The issue is love, right? People love the darkness, and that love explains why suppression happens in the first place. Now, unfortunately, I think this is where even some Christians miss the force of what the Bible is saying here, what Jesus and what Paul is saying. You see, every single one of us has a will, my friends, and that will is real. It's authentic. It matters. But interestingly enough, the Bible never describes that will as free in the way that we often think about it. Rather, Scripture describes the will that we have as governed, or more importantly, as enslaved by what we love and desire the most. In other words, just to put it plainly, we always choose according to our strongest desire. Or even put another way, we never do what we do not desire to do. And so to make this a little bit more concrete, I want to borrow an illustration that R.C. Sproul used to use, right? I want you to imagine that you're being robbed at gunpoint and the robber demands your wallet. Now, in that moment, you're faced with two options, at least as I can see it. You can either give the person your wallet and live to see another day, or you can refuse to give the person your wallet and potentially die. Now, most people who love life, who desire to live, are probably going to hand over their wallet. And that choice is perfectly rational, right? You can cancel the credit cards, you can replace the IDs, you can deal with all of the inconvenience later, but at least you're alive, right? That's exactly the thought process that a lot of people are probably going to go through. Now, I understand that someone might object to that and say, but I don't want to give them my wallet, Janai. And you know what? That's true. But I just need you to understand that your desire to live at that moment is even stronger than your desire to avoid the inconvenience of handing over your wallet. Now, I know it is at this point that someone else might say, well, Janai, what if I fight back, right? What if I try to, see if I can hit him with a 1-2 punch and knock him out, take the gun, live happily ever after. And look, I even hear that response. But I just need you to see that even there, the exact same logic applies. You fight back because you believe you can win and still live. And so as you can see, underneath every single option that you give me is the same governing desire, a desire to preserve life. And so once you see that, you start to realize that you can apply this logic to just about every decision that you've ever made, right? You always act according to what you love the most. And so when we apply this principle to unbelief, the picture becomes absolutely even more clear. Because apart from Christ, our deepest desire as human beings, marked by sin, is autonomy. It's self-rule, right? We saw this in the Garden of Eden. And as Jesus says, we do not love the light. And because we love the darkness, we actively suppress the truth that we instinctively know in order to pursue the thing that we love the most. That's exactly what Scripture has been teaching us. And just to be clear, this isn't merely an atheist problem. This is a human problem. This is who all of us are apart from Christ. And I know some Christians might bristle at that, but I just want you to know at that point, the disagreement isn't really with me, right? Rather, it's with Scripture itself. And so if suppression is rooted in love and desire, how does that actually work itself out? And the answer is that it doesn't manifest this way in only one way, as many people like to assume. You see, yes, it is true that sometimes it shows up in just outright lying. But more often than not, it actually shows up in different ways, like, constant re-explanation, or as moral borrowing, or as scientific deferral, or as ethical inconsistency, or as endless rationalization, right? We see a litany of different options as we start to drill down on this a bit more, right? And as we saw earlier, with the example of Richard Dawkins and John Lydics, right? We saw him kind of refer or defer those explanations as to how we come to have something rather than nothing. We saw Richard Dawkins kind of defer that into the future, right? And again, that's a prime example of suppression, right? Suppression doesn't always deny the truth outright. Sometimes suppression merely postpones it indefinitely. And so here's the careful conclusion that we need to land on. And I want to say this as clearly as possible. It is lazy to say that Romans chapter 1 simply teaches that every atheist or every agnostic is a liar, right? That is an oversimplification, and it completely misses Paul's depth that he's aiming for here. But it is accurate to say that Romans chapter 1 diagnoses the suppression of known truth. That is absolutely accurate to say. And those two claims are not in contradiction with one another, right? We can and must hold them both together. And I think when we do, something important becomes absolutely clear to us, because this doesn't negate sincerity, rather explains why sincerity doesn't settle the issue, right? Someone can sincerely feel unconvinced. They can sincerely feel unpersuaded. They can sincerely feel at peace with their unbelief and still be dealing with that deeper inward moral resistance that they don't fully recognize. And I think it's at this point where the gospel really finally comes into view. Because you see, if ignorance were truly the problem, then information would save us. But if suppression is the problem, then that means grace is necessary, right? And that's why faith, my friends, is called a gift in the first place. If faith could be generated by our own will, right, by our own power, then it wouldn't be called a gift, now wouldn't it? Right? It would be considered something that we could boast in, right? But Paul explicitly says that we cannot boast in it, right? Because it is a gift, right? That's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians that he resolved to know nothing except Christ and him crucified, right? The hope of salvation doesn't rest in clever arguments or eloquent speech. Rather, it rests in the gospel. Right now, that's not a call to abandon thinking, but rather it's a reminder why thinking alone is never enough, in other words. And so what can we take from all this? Well, I think we can take a few very important things from this conversation. The first thing that I think we can take away is that the fundamental problem with many atheists is not simply that they are liars in a crude or shallow sense. Rather, the deeper issue, according to Romans chapter 1, is that the truth about God has been suppressed inwardly for them. And even more foundational than that, the root problem is one of love and desire. What is love most, by not just atheists, but by every single human being apart from Christ, is not God, it's the light. It's the darkness, right? And because that's the case, the truth that is known is actively pushed down, it's restrained, and it's held at bay so that a life can be lived on those terms, right? That's the first thing that we can take away. Now, the second takeaway is that this is not merely an atheist problem. This is a human problem, right? This is all of us apart from Christ. Paul tells us elsewhere, echoing Isaiah, that none is righteous, no, not one. No one seeks after God. And that's not because God is hidden or obscure, but because seeking God is not what we desire in our natural state. And because it's not what we desire, we actively suppress that truth in unrighteousness. That diagnosis doesn't single out atheists in a uniquely way. Rather, it places all of humanity on the same level ground in need of grace. And so that leads us to the third and probably most important takeaway. If suppression is the problem, then my friends, argumentation alone will never be the solution, right? That's why the call for Christians is not merely to win debates or to sharpen your rhetorical skills, but rather it's just to faithfully preach the gospel, right? The gospel is the only thing that actually addresses the root cause or the root issue of the heart. It's the only thing that can reorder our lives and open blind eyes and bring someone from darkness to light. And so if you're an atheist or an agnostic watching this video, my call for you is actually pretty simple. It's not merely just to consider another argument or to wait for better data. The call that I think scripture gives you right now is just to repent and believe the gospel. Because according to the Bible, that is the only way your eyes are truly open. It's not going to be through clever reasoning or more persuasive argumentation, but it's going to be through grace, through faith, right? And honestly, we see this admission over and over and over again, right? Even from atheists themselves, right? How many videos are out there where atheists are basically asked the question, what would it take for you to believe? And the answers continuously range from, well, God would have to do this, or God would have to do that, or God would have to speak to me directly in this kind of way, or I would need to see this extraordinary, undeniable experience, right, that I can't explain away by way of hallucination, all this other stuff. And the list just keeps going on and on. The goalposts, as we see, just keeps moving. And as they move, the demands become more and more outlandish. And so I just want to put every atheist and every agnostic at ease by just saying this plainly. There is no argumentation that is going to change your mind, right? We can just cut to the chase right immediately. I can present you with the most airtight, philosophically rigorous, intellectually persuasive argument imaginable. And guess what? That still would not change your heart posture, because that's the real issue. You see, the problem is not first and foremost some type of intellectual deficiency. Rather, the problem is a heart problem. And until that heart of stone is replaced with a heart of flesh, no experience, my friends, no miracle, no argument will ever penetrate it. And look, that's not an insult. It's a diagnosis. And it's exactly why the gospel, and not just arguments alone, is the only real hope for anyone to come to saving faith. And look, I know there's going to be some atheists and agnostics who's probably going to slam me for saying that in the comment section, but that's the truth of the matter, right? That's how we can make sense of everything that we're seeing so far. But all right, guys, look, that's the video. Look, if this was helpful for you, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe and do all of that awesome stuff. It really does help the channel out a lot. And as always, I just want to thank every single one of you for watching. But until next time, guys, peace.